Hello dear students, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today we have few important news articles. Those news articles are covered in the Hindu newspaper. So we will discuss all those important news articles so that it will be helpful for your prelims and mains examination in the competitive exams. So first try to solve the yesterday's practice question. The question was in relation to a report named India Employment Report 2024, which of the following organizations have published this particular India Employment Report? So option A, International Labour Organization, option B, International Trade Union Confederation, option C, Institute for Human Development. See, the correct answer for this question is option D, because International Labour Organization and Institute for Human Development, both these organizations together have jointly published the India Employment Report 2024. So because of that reason, option D is correct for this question. Okay, so this India Employment Report has published various employment details in India and at the same time the unemployment details also. So because of that reason, it is in use in recent times. So let's try to solve the yesterday's practice question. So the term poem 3 is talked about in the context of which of the following? The options: option A, genes introduced in the genetically modified plants, development of India's own artificial intelligence chatbot, radio collars for wildlife tracking, and some orbital experiments which are being done by ISRO. So please try to answer this question in the comment section, and right answer for this question will give in the next lecture. Now first very important news article, Africa at the center. So we all knew that Africa is a mineral rich country, and it is also very often said that Africa is the future. Africa is the future. And at the same time, if you look at India's relations with Africa, India has been enjoying a lot of goodwill and trust among the people of Africa and along with the countries. Because if you can look at India in 2023 hosted the G20 summit. India was the president of G20 summit in the year 2023. In this G20 summit, India has taken an initiative to include African Union as part of the G20 grouping. So that is the significant milestone in India-Africa relations. And it is also said that India is traditionally the leader of Global South, and Africa is an important component of the Global South. So if India wanted to test its leadership as the leader of Global South, Africa is a pillar. So therefore, in this context, we will understand why Africa is at the center in India's relations, particularly with respect to the Global South. So there are certain arguments that are being given by the author. So we will understand all those important arguments that are provided by the author. So why India must put Africa at the heart of Global South vision? Now please understand, India has Global South vision. Global South vision. Now Global South includes countries which are developing, underdeveloped, and the least developing countries, which are countries in South America, countries in Africa, and also countries in South Asia, and countries which are part of the Southeast Asia. So all those countries are considered as part of the Global South. So we all know that traditionally India is known as the leader of the Global South, and India also has the Global South vision. And if you look at the Global South, all common things between the global countries of all Global South is that they have common challenges. They have the common challenges that they are facing. For example, unemployment is a common challenge that these countries have been facing. Climate change is also a common challenge. Terrorism, and inadequate connectivity, lack of education infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure. So all these are challenges that the global south has been facing. So it is also thought that the global south can overcome all these challenges by collaboration and cooperation. So in collaboration and cooperation of the global south, India is leading this particular region from the front lines. Okay, so India has been playing a leadership role in the global south to ensure adequate cooperation and collaboration is maintained between all those countries. Now in this context, recently Indian President Srimati Draupadi Murmu recently visited Mauritius. Okay, so India's President Draupadi Murmu recently went to Mauritius, and on her official visit to Mauritius, she described this particular India's relationship with Africa in large and Mauritius in particular, a close maritime neighbor. Mauritius is a close maritime neighbor and a cherished partner for the Indian Ocean region and a key player in our Africa outreach. Okay, so this is how Indian President has described about Mauritius. So that tells us a lot about India's Africa outreach. How India keeps Africa at the center of its global south vision. So apart from that, when Indian President Draupadi Murmu visited Mauritius, she inaugurated around 14 community development projects. Okay, see, in those African countries, India has been undertaking the capacity building efforts. Now, capacity building efforts essentially means that skilling African workforce is an attempt to build capacities, improving healthcare infrastructure, improving the education infrastructure, and providing essential technologies to improve the agriculture productivity. So all those things comes under the capacity building. And recently, India has inaugurated 14 community development projects in African country. And at the same time, India also laid a foundation stone for the forensic science laboratory, all with the Indian assistance. So there will be a forensic science laboratory, and that will help combating or preventing the crime rate in African country. Okay, so all this will be built with the Indian assistance alone. However, India works towards institutionalizing the concept of global south. Now India wanted to be a leader of the global south, so therefore it wanted to institutionalize the concept of global south. So we can see this India's attempt where India has launched an initiative to include African Union as part of the G20 grouping. So this tells us that India wanted to institutionalize the concept of global south, and there are differing views with respect to India's global south vision, okay, and its effectiveness. So first view with respect to India's global south is that it is a force for change. If India is looking itself as a leader of the global south, we can consider this as a force for change, and at the same time India has been advocating a more inclusive global governance structure. Now inclusive global governance structure actually means that a global governance structure where it is not dominated by few countries, but all countries have their relevance at the global level when it comes to the global governance, and that is where India comes in, and that is where India has been demanding reforming the institutions of global governance, and India has already taken an initiative in this regard. So the example is African Union inclusion into the G20. right? So India want to reform the institutions of global governance to make them more and more inclusive, to include all the underdeveloped countries and developing countries. And that is where all these countries will recognize India as a leader of the global south. However, there are some other experts who have been claiming or critiquing that oversimplifying a complex world order. So when we have been emphasizing on the global south, the critics have been arguing that we have been oversimplifying the existing complex world order. So this is not how it actually works, but there are a lot of strategic and geopolitical interest that comes into play, and that makes India will not be a real leader of the global south. So each country have their own interests. So that is what the experts have been saying. Okay, so India has been oversimplifying the existing multipolar world order, our existing global order. So despite the term's utility, term's utility means despite the utility of global south for India. Okay, so despite the term having the utility for India, particularly in the stage of multipolarity. Now multipolarity, so you need to understand different terms with respect to the international order. For example, when we talk about the bipolar world order, now bipolar world order we have seen during the Cold War times, where there are where the world is divided into two different poles. For example, one pole led by US and the other pole led by USSR. So that is known as the bipolar world order. Okay, so after the fall or collapse of the USSR, the world is known as the unipolar world order. Unipolar world order. Okay, world order. Because USA was the sole power after the collapse of the USSR, and because of that reason the world is known as the unipolar world order. Now if you look at the current world order, it is very often described as a multipolar world order. Why multipolar world order? Now China has been challenging the US hegemony first. Not just China, there are several other middle powers such as India, Japan, Brazil. So all these countries have been challenging the unipolar or the bipolar world order, thereby world making a transition from the bipolar or unipolar world order to a multipolar world order. Okay, now if you look at India, it is said that India situates itself in one of the leading voices of the global south, and there is no doubt about that. Now if you look at the WTO negotiations, India stands with the developing countries. And even if you look at any major global treaty, India very often advocates the voice of the developing countries, and because of this reason it is said that India is a leader of the global south. Now in this context, what should be the rationale and why we need to strengthen our ties with the African countries, or why we should keep Africa at the center? That is what we need to understand. Now first understand the potential of Africa, the future potential of Africa in this context. So Africa's significant growth rate of 3.8%. So Africa now has been registering around 3.8% of the annual growth rate. Okay, so if you compare Africa's growth rate with the developed countries' growth rate, so Africa's growth rate is comparatively better, and in future it is expected that Africa would grow much faster. And at the same time, now if you look at the younger population in Africa, around 60% of the Africa's population is below 25 years of age. So they have a lot of demographic dividend. So the other advantage is that they have a lot of demographic dividend, and the total population of Africa will reach 1.1 billion by 2040. So because of this huge potential, it is said that the future is Africa. It is said that the future is Africa because of a lot of advantages that the Africa has. Now India has a demographic dividend, and China has reached that specific place in today's world because it has utilized its existing demographic dividend. And India has also recording highest levels of growth rate because of its demographic dividend. In a similar case, since majority of its population are young, Africa will also record higher levels of growth rate, and this is also makes an attractive thing for India to keep Africa at its center of engagement. Followed by that, now if India, so as of now, India navigates an evolving global landscape. So it is said that the global landscape has been evolving. The world has been moving from unipolar world order to a multipolar world order. So because of that reason, it is said that India is navigating an evolving global order. And India's multifaceted relationship with Africa offers significant number of opportunities. So since Africa has a lot of potential, this particular potential will definitely help India in its future growth aspirations. It offers a lot of opportunities for India. Now, what opportunities Africa will provide for India? So we will understand those things, those opportunities that Africa can provide to India. First and foremost, the potential for economic partnership between India and Africa. So there is an immense potential for the economic partnership or economic cooperation between Africa and India, because now if you look at the total investments from India to Africa, it is around 98 billion. Okay, so it is one of its highest, 98 billion total investments in the year 2023. So followed by that, if you look at the total trade between India and Africa, it is around 100 billion. Okay, so it is also one of highest trade that India has ever had with any bloc. Okay, so I mean, it is also among one of the highest trade with any bloc. So therefore trade has reached 100 billion, and at the same time India's investments in Africa also reached 98 billion. Because of that reason, it is said that there is an immense potential for the economic partnership between India and Africa, and in future also it is expected to rapidly increase. However, one concern here is that China's investments in Africa are more compared to India, and China's bilateral trade with Africa is also more compared to India. However, in future it is expected that India would be able to compete with China in its engagement and economic cooperation with Africa. Now, apart from that, 42 African countries, so they are the second largest recipients of India's credit. Now India extend credit to different countries. For example, India extend credits to Maldives, credit to Bhutan, Bangladesh, right? So if you look at India's total credit flow to these African countries, the second largest recipient. Okay, so around 200 developmental projects have been completed in the region with India's assistance. So that is where it generates a lot of goodwill. Okay, so that is where it generates a lot of goodwill in these African countries towards India. So India is building on that particular goodwill. So followed by that, Africa's influence in our global forums will be important for India's vision of global south. Now there are a lot of global forums, and the collective voice of Africa in support of India will certainly help us, right? So we wanted to get a place in global high table such as United Nations Security Council, and at the same time we also wanted to reform the institutions of global governance, and that is where the Africa's voice in support of India will become very crucial and very important, right? So global south actually houses 3/4 of humanity. So it is said that 3/4 of the population of the world lives in the global south, and apart from that 39% of the global south is also contributed by the global south alone. So therefore there is a call to reform the existing structures towards more inclusive system that focused on development. As I have already explained you that the global governance institutions should be more inclusive. They should not be dominated by very few countries. Rather, all countries should have the equal voice in all those organizations. For example, if you look at United Nations Security Council, So Africa has no representation, Latin America has no representation, and Asia is underrepresented. And that is where India has been calling for the reform of the institutions of global governance. And apart from that, now if you look at areas where we can develop synergies with the African countries or with the African continent, there are a lot of areas where we can develop those synergies. So first and foremost, we need to talk about cooperation in the critical mineral sector. So why critical mineral sector? Because Africa is a mineral rich country. Africa is mineral rich continent, right? So recently we have also discussed that India has been planning to diversify its supply of essential minerals. So therefore, as part of this plan, India will look towards Africa for the supply of critical minerals. Okay, so because Africa has a lot of minerals, and mineral cooperation would have a lot of synergy, a lot of scope for further strengthening the bilateral relations between India and the African continent. Now, if you look at the African continent as a whole, you can see on this image how it has a lot of mineral resources in different parts of Africa. So, to build the solar panels and to build batteries, which are necessary for the low carbon future, or decarbonization of our existing economies, or making a transition from the fossil fuels to the green economy, access to minerals such as critical minerals, transition minerals, green minerals are very important, and all those minerals are available in the African continent. So because of that reason, we can further enhance our cooperation with the African continent, and we can procure the minerals. Okay, so that is where it becomes supply chain resilient, because Africa can supply those essential minerals without any interruption. Rather than we depending on one single source for supply of those essential or critical minerals, we need to diversify our existing mineral supply chains. So that is where we can ensure the resilience of supply chains. And in fact, Africa has 30% of the global mineral resources. That is a huge amount of mineral resources that Africa has. So Africa has 30% of the world's mineral resources. And it is a very important to power the energy transition. Right? So energy transition means, please understand, now we mostly using fossil fuels. So what is the concern with the fossil fuels? Fossil fuels releases pollutants into the environment, and at the same time they have also been releasing carbon into the environment. Now carbon is a greenhouse gas, and that has been increasing the global temperatures, leading to climate change. So as part of the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, India has announced several pledges that we will reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So in order to make a green transition, we require those critical minerals. So that is where energy transition becomes very, very important. And after that, if you look at the geographical concentration of critical minerals, okay, so the concentration or the presence of critical minerals, diversifying sources and fostering strategic partnership with the resource-rich African nations. We need to further strengthen the strategic partnerships, and we should further diversify our mineral supply chains, particularly with the resource-rich African countries, and that is very important for India's overall growth and security. So we cannot depend on one single country for the supply of those essential minerals. Rather, we need to diversify our existing supply chains, and that is very important. That is where it is very important. And in fact, the government of India prepares for a new industrial revolution, a new industrial age. Now, this particular industrial age requires supply chain resilience. So this must ensure that India's supply chain is resilient. India's supply chain is diversified. So in this context, Africa also wanted to capture the value chains across the globe. So therefore, for Africa, India is an opportunity, right? So integrate itself with the global value chains, and that would further enhance the cooperation between India and Africa in this regard. Okay, now apart from that, if you look at India's total or overall engagement with Africa, India essentially helps these countries through capacity building. Okay, so capacity building of African workforces and modernizing and building the existing infrastructure in these countries, because that is very important, and it actually builds on the long-term cooperation of India with those countries. Now if you look at India's total engagement or overall engagement with Afghanistan, India has focused on this particular long-term infrastructure development, and that is where it has generated a lot of goodwill among the people of Afghanistan towards India. So after that, India has a long-standing commitment with respect to education, capacity building in Africa, and in fact, New Delhi can also significantly develop the collaborations to establish, establish different kind of relations with the African technical organizations. And apart from that, the Indian research institutes have also been regularly engaging with the African research community, and this will facilitate the creation of solutions to the global south challenges. Please understand that all the countries in global south have been facing the common challenges. So therefore, in this respect, it is very important for all those countries to address those global challenges. However, as of now, technology transfer and financial assistance from the developed world to all the countries in the developing world is very scarce, and in fact it is said that those countries have not been providing technology and financial assistance. So therefore, in this context, the collaboration and cooperation between all these countries in the global south is very important, so that they can address those challenges collectively addressing the existing challenges that the global south is been facing, and in this context India could play a larger role. So in fact, we are now living in an era of geopolitical competition and realignment. So there is no doubt that one single country or one sovereign country has been realigning with the other country, and one region has been realigning with the other region, and we are also living in an era of geopolitical competition. So therefore, in this context, India's multifaceted relationship with African nations is poised for a fundamental transformation. And at the same time, India has to make its engagement with Africa more and more resilient. Okay, so more and more resilient, and that is where we can build a long-term partnership. And it is also expected that India's Africa engagement is a fundamental transformation in recent past. So that could strengthen the existing relations between India and Africa and builds long-term strategic partnership between these two regions. And apart from that, it is also said that India's aspirations for the global south can actually take shape leveraging the historical partnership with African countries, and that is where it is very important. So if India wanted to fulfill its aspirations as the leader of the global south, it is very important that India maintains robust and resilient ties with the African nations, and that is where India can achieve its aim of becoming the leader of global south. And this is what the author has been discussing in this particular article. So let's try to discuss another important news article. So the news article is with respect to the Great Indian Bustard. Okay, so this article is given in the Indian Express newspaper, and the Great Indian Bustard is also very often in news. So therefore, there is a higher probability that you will get a question on this. So power threat to the bustard bird species. Now, if you look at the Great Indian Bustard, so this is how this bird looks like. However, in recent past, the numbers of Great Indian Bustard have been significantly declining. So there are a number of reasons for the significant decline in the bird numbers. So if you look at the habitat of Great Indian Bustard, they primarily live in arid regions and semi-arid regions, particularly in the grasslands of Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and parts of Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh. So this is the habitat of the great Indian bustard. So however, in recent times, the habitat loss of the great Indian bustard is a major concern, and that leads to the declining population. And apart from that, there are actually the power lines which are built. Okay, so power lines which are built through the habitat of great Indian bustard. So very often these species have been colliding with the power lines, and that led to the significant drop in the numbers, a significant death of the bird species. So because of this reason, a petition was filed in the Supreme Court against the power transmission lines on the great Indian bustard habitat. So in this context, Supreme Court has provided a series of directions for the respective state government and to the central government to make sure that these power lines are not passing through the great Indian bustard habitat, because it is leading to their decline in their populations. And the Supreme Court has also directed that these power lines should be built underground so that it will not threaten the great Indian bustard. However, the center has said that it is unable to fit these power lines underground. Okay, so that is why this particular article is in news. Now, if this species number further drops significantly, it would lead to the extinction of the species, and we cannot recover this particular species. And in a food chain, every species plays a very important role. Okay, so if one species goes out of food chain, that will lead to the collapse of entire food chain. Okay, so because one species depends on the other species. Now imagine, for example, if pollinator bee goes extinct. So this pollinator bee plays a very important role in the plant diversity. Okay, several other plants which depend on the pollinator bee for pollination, for cross fertilization, they also go extinct. And if plants go extinct gradually, plants play a role as a primary producers. If plants starts extinct, or they went extinct, then other species which depend on those species which already extinct, they also go extinct. So this is like a chain, and this will have a lot of implications on the entire ecosystem. And that is where conservation of each species in an ecosystem is very, very important. Now we will understand some details with respect to the great Indian bustard. Now great Indian bustard is found on the Indian subcontinent. When I say Indian subcontinent, not just on India. So Pakistan is part of the Indian subcontinent, Nepal is part of the Indian subcontinent. However, the great Indian bustard is found in the Indian subcontinent, and it is also said that this is heaviest flying birds on the planet. Okay, so this is one of the heaviest flying birds on the on Earth. And now if you look at the distribution of the great Indian bustard, so current viable populations of great Indian bustard is between 100 to 150 individuals only. Okay, so just 100 and 150 populations of great Indian bustard, that's it. And they mainly survives in Thar desert of Rajasthan, that holds about 100 individuals. In fact, the Thar desert of India in Rajasthan has 100 of these birds, and it is also said that it is the state bird of Rajasthan. Okay, great Indian bustard is the state bird of Rajasthan. Okay, so apart from that, when you look at the habitat, so it inhabits dry grasslands and scrublands. Some other details with respect to the great Indian bustard. So in Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, AP, so this is how the species are actually distributed. Okay, so if you look at the threats that the great Indian bustard has been facing, fatal collisions with the power lines. They are very often colliding with the power lines. Second, nest predation by native predators such as fox, mongoose, crow, etc. And after that, hunting in Pakistan is also another issue that leads to the significantly declining populations of great Indian bustard. And agriculture expansion is also another concern, because now there are no grasslands. The grasslands are being converted into agriculture farming lands. So after that, the pesticide prevalence such as food reduction and even food contamination. So that leads to the failure of the digestive system of these species. And grazing pressures, plantation of shrubs, trees in grasslands, and poor land use policies and habitat loss. So all these factors are mostly responsible for the significant decline in the number of these species. Okay, so all these threats have made Great Indian bustard to stand at the edge of extinction. Okay, so if measures are not taken, this species would go extinct in future, and that is a major concern for us. The population has been declining significantly. In last 50 years, it is said that 90% of the Great Indian bustard population has declined. Okay, so there is a reduction of 90% of the population since 1969. And population size was 1260 in 1969. Now it is reached to 100 to 150 birds. Okay, so these are some statistics with respect to the Great Indian bustard species. Okay, so conservation status of Great Indian bustard. For example, IUCN list of threatened species. It is critically endangered. Now, after critically endangered, extinction in the wild. If extinction in the wild, and if extinction in the wild is not successful, bird will completely extinct. Okay, so this is the time that we need to wake up and at the same time take appropriate measures to conserve this particular precious bird. Now, Wildlife Protection Act has also provided for 6 schedules, and 6 schedules also extend different degrees of protection for different animals. So Schedule 1 means extending highest degree of protection for this bird species. Okay, so this is included in the Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act. So equal to tiger, lion and elephant. And CITES Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, that is CITES. This is a legally binding convention and it is placed in Appendix 1. So Appendix 1 means trade is prohibited. Trade is allowed only under exceptional conditions. Otherwise, trade in this particular bird species would not be allowed under CITES Convention. So this is the protection status of the Great Indian bustard. Now, recently, Supreme Court has made an intervention with respect to the conservation of the Great Indian bustard. So what was the Supreme Court's intervention? What Supreme Court has said? So in the year 2021, there was a petition that was filed in the Supreme Court with respect to the power lines which are passing through the habitat of Great Indian bustard. So Supreme Court in April 2021 ordered that all overhead power transmission lines in the habitat or in the core area of the Great Indian bustard in Gujarat and Rajasthan should be made underground. Okay, so I have already told you that these power lines are actually responsible for the collisions of the bird species. So therefore the court has directed that they should be made underground so that the Great Indian bustard population will not colliding with these power lines. And secondly, the decision of the Supreme Court was reviewed in 2022. In 2022 November, the court sought report from the chief secretaries of the two states like Rajasthan and Gujarat. So within 6 weeks of the installation of bird diverters in priority areas. And apart from that, the Supreme Court has also asked these two states, both Rajasthan and Gujarat, to assess the total length of transmission lines needed to be made underground. So this is what the Supreme Court has told the Rajasthan and Gujarat chief secretaries with respect to the Great Indian bustard protection. However, in March 2024, Supreme Court again come up with a new order. So in this particular order in March 2024, the Supreme Court has said that it would review its April 2021 order. Okay, so to bury underground all power lines in the habitat of the Great Indian bustard, because earlier the Supreme Court has ordered to make underground all these power lines. So it also created a 7-member committee. Right, the Supreme Court created a 7-member committee, and that committee will suggest steps to protect and conserve the Great Indian bustard, because the populations of Great Indian bustards have been significantly declining. So therefore there is a need to conserve this particular species. So in order to do that, the Supreme Court has constituted a 7-member committee. identifying the critical areas where power lines may have to go underground. So this committee will undergo, will suggest critical areas, identify the critical areas where power lines may have to go underground. However, there are certain arguments that are being provided by the center with respect to the undergrounding all power lines. So what was the response of the center? So that is what we need to understand. The center said taking lines of 66 kV and higher voltage underground was not feasible for the evacuation of bulk power. So it is not feasible attempt. We cannot do it. We cannot make 66 kV and higher voltage underground. Was not feasible. Okay, so this is particularly due to various constraints such as transmission losses, maintenance challenges, multiple cable joints, and increased time requirements and concerns for the safety. Because of all these reasons, it is suggested that it is not a feasible thing to do. Okay, so that's where the issue starts, because there's no doubt that these power lines are responsible for it. Okay, so power lines are actually responsible for the collision of the Great Indian Bustard. So therefore, there is an appropriate solution that has to be taken in this regard. We need to prevent the collisions of Great Indian Bustard, and these power lines passing through the habitat of Great Indian Bustard is especially challenging, and that has been reducing its population. So therefore, in this context, a sustainable solutions have to be found out in this context. Now let's try to discuss the next important question. So government extends validity for the foreign contribution registration of NGOs till June. Okay, so please understand, government extends the validity for the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act registration for NGOs till June 30. Okay, so now in this context, we will understand what exactly is the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. Now this Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, the overall objective of bringing this Foreign Contribution Regulation Act was, we have a lot of NGOs in India, right? So these NGOs receive foreign funding. These NGOs receive foreign funding. However, it is said that the foreign funding in these NGOs is very often led to taking up the anti-national activities. So that have been impacting the sovereignty, territorial integrity and security of the state, and that apart from that, these NGOs are very often involved in the religious conversions of the people, religious conversions of the people, and at the same time, they also receiving the black money through the NGO channels. So therefore, recently the government had tightened the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act rules, making it mandatory for the every NGO to register with the State Bank of India Delhi branch. So registration and registration certificate, and along with that registration, the renewal of the registration is also very important. So therefore, these NGOs and particularly NGOs which have been receiving the foreign funding would be under the scanner of the Union Home Ministry, so that they will not receive funds illegally into their accounts, and that will not be used for subversive activities in India. Now we will understand this news clearly. So what exactly is the news? The news is that Union Home Ministry has extended the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act registration validity for all NGOs till June 30. So this is particularly due to delays in processing applications. Okay, so all NGOs under Foreign Contribution Regulation Act registration validity has extended till June 30. Now, if you look at the non-governmental organizations, so they can be established or they mentioned in the section 8 under the Companies Act of 2013. And they are also recognized as societies under Societies Registration Act 1860 and also trust under the Indian Trust Act of 1882. Okay, so these non-governmental organizations work for a particular cause. Okay, for example, they can work for education, healthcare, and they can also work for environment. Okay, so there are different NGOs which are working for different causes, and at the same time, these NGOs are also receiving funds from the foreign governments and foreign countries, and that is where it is a concern. So in order to scrutinize these NGOs from where they are receiving funds, the Union government has further tightened the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act provisions. Okay, so we will understand briefly what exactly is the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act registration extension. Okay, so this is news, right? So the Union Home Ministry extends the validity for the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act registration for all the NGOs and associations till June 30. Secondly, many registrations were due to renewal from the September 29, 2020 with a mandatory renewal of every 5 years. So these NGOs and other associations have to be mandatorily registered with the Ministry of Home Affairs every 5 years. If they fail to register with the Ministry of Home Affairs, then their status as an NGO would be cancelled. They no longer receive funds from the foreign governments. And the ministry has also extended the validity time for 9 times so far since 2020 due to the processing delays, and with the recent orders extending certificates till June 30, 2024. So this is the good news for those NGOs which have not registered yet. Okay, so what exactly is the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act? So the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act was enacted in 1976 during the period of emergency. So it was brought during the emergency period particularly to regulate the foreign donations and prevent interference in India's affairs. Okay, so because NGOs would be funded by the foreign governments, and foreign governments have been start interfering through this particular funding. So in order to prevent the foreign interference, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act was passed. So there are certain amendments that are being made to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. In 2010, amendments were brought. So amendment include consolidation of regular foreign contributions and preventing activities against the national interest. The second amendment was brought in the year 2020. So that amendment prohibits transfer of foreign funds, and it also limits the administrative expenses to 20%. Okay, so registration and regulation of these NGOs under Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. So registration is very important for receiving these foreign funds. Registration of these NGOs is in fact mandatory. Secondly, applicants must open a designated bank account in New Delhi's State Bank of India branch. So these are some rules with respect to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. So however, it essentially to prevent the interference of the foreign governments, foreign agencies in the affairs of India. Okay, so that's all in today's lecture. If you really like our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. And thank you so much, and we will meet tomorrow. Thank you.